For most of us, death is the end of our physical existence. Death is final and irreversible.
I'm expecting when I die to be frozen. They're going to just keep my head and brain in suspension at minus 196 centigrade for hundreds of years.
At Alcor in California, they're preparing dead bodies for the deep freeze. These people believe in cryonic suspension, the practice of storing legally dead bodies at very low temperatures. If you're a cryonicist, this is not a dead body, it's a patient.
I have no idea what form I'll be coming back as, because the technology available will just be capable of doing almost anything. I imagine what would happen is that they would essentially scan your brain in its frozen state and then reconstruct that first and then basically ask your mind, you, what type of body do you want to come back as?
The first stage in the cryonic suspension process is to restore circulation and breathing artificially, and this is done with a heart-lung resuscitator. Then we wash out the patient's blood with a heart-lung machine that's mounted on this cart and replace it with Viaspan, which is an organ preservation solution. This allows us to safely transport the patient, and we do that, bring the patient into the facility here. The patient is then moved from this cart onto the operating table, and we then connect the patient to a heart-lung machine. The heart-lung machine allows us to introduce protective drugs into the patient's body to help minimize the damage that we do from freezing. One of the drugs that we use is glycerol. It's a thick syrupy liquid that is diluted with a blood substitute and used to replace about half of the water in the patient's body. Once this is done, if the patient's a neuropatient, his head or her head is surgically isolated from the rest of the body's cremated. If it's a whole body patient, the patient is placed in a sleeping bag and cooled to liquid nitrogen temperature. In either case, storage goes on at liquid nitrogen temperature, which is about 200 degrees below 0 centigrade.
In the United Kingdom, those who've signed up for cryonic suspension meet every month. It's the Cryonic Social Club. They hope to come back to life in the future, so they figure they'll need a few old friends with similar experiences.
We haven't got a thought.
No.
All we've got to do is freeze them, transport people through to future technology, use cryonics with today's imperfections as an ambulance for the future. As a time machine.
Metaphor for the future.
That's it.
As yet, Alcor UK's ambulance hasn't been used. They're waiting for one of their group to die.
In the future, the workings of the human metabolism are going to be as well understood as cars are nowadays. If a car malfunctions, your car doesn't just die and become completely worthless. What you do is that you take it along to a garage and you have it repaired. What cryonics is like, essentially, is just sticking your car, your body, into a lock-up garage for 100 years until the technology comes around to put it back in working order again.
So if cryonicists think they can be revived from the dead, what's their definition of death?
Well, sometimes the best way to understand something is to use an example. And this is an example that most people should be familiar with. This is a computer disk. They store information just like our brains store information. If I take this computer disk and I cut it in half, clearly it won't function anymore, it won't run. And yet, all of the information that makes the disk up is still here. And it's possible, in theory, to put the two halves back together again. However, there's another way you could damage this. I could light this on fire, and when I do, the information is gone forever. There's no way that we know of, with our current understanding of physics and science that we'd ever be able to recover information from a system, a computer disk in this case, that's damaged in this way. And the same is true of biological systems. You and I are made up of material, made up of atoms. And when the pattern of atoms that makes us up is disrupted in this kind of way, rather than in this kind of way, we're lost forever. What cryonics is all about is preventing this kind of damage from turning into this kind of damage.
I don't want to die. And should I walk across the street tomorrow and get hit by a bus, Alcor may be my only chance. But any chance is better than nothing at all.
This room is the patient care area of the Alcor facility. Currently, we have 7 whole-body patients in storage here. These containers are topped off, filled with liquid nitrogen, approximately once every 2 weeks. This vault contains neuro patients who've chosen to have just their heads placed in cryonic suspension. Currently, we're filling the container, servicing it by adding liquid nitrogen to it. There are 8 patients in storage in this unit. We have a variety of people in suspension. There's a physician in there, a medical doctor, a speech correctionist, a liquor store owner and his wife, a couple career military officers, a wide range of people who want a second chance at life.
Of course, I've heard that the odds of this working, I've heard them quoted at anything from a 1 in a million to 1 in 100.
This is Miles. We met 5 years ago in a laboratory where we put him to sleep, packed him in ice, chilled him to 50 Fahrenheit, replaced his blood with blood substitute, kept him down for over an hour. Miles was clinically dead at the time. He had no brain waves, had no heartbeat, and of course had no reflexes. Warmed him up, put blood back in him, and brought him back to life. He's lived with us ever since, in perfectly good health. To give you an idea of how normal he is, I'm going to show you his ability to walk like a circus dog, his one great trick, in pursuit of cheese. These dogs don't naturally walk around so easily on their hind legs. If he was brain damaged, there'd be a good likelihood that he couldn't balance quite so well.
Cost for neurosuspension, or head-only suspension, is around 31,000 pounds. Neuro patients go in containers such as you see here. They're very compact and easy to store. Cost for a whole-body suspension is approximately 90,000 pounds, and whole-body patients are stored 4 to each unit such as you see there.
You don't have to raise the money till after you're dead, so an life insurance policy seems the best way of doing it. And it's quite cheap. I think it's only about £5 or £10 a month. It's a lot less than smoking.
With current technology, the main problems with cryonics fall into 4 areas. The first is that a patient who's presented for cryonic suspension has already suffered a terminal illness from which they haven't been able to be cured. And the second is that they've already been declared clinically dead, a process which is at the moment irreversible. And then the process of the cryonic suspension itself, to take a whole body and freeze it, imposes irreversible damage on the complex tissues and organs of which it's made up. And the fourth is that in order to rewarm a frozen body, the thawing process itself imposes yet more damage on the tissues.
If cryonics is going to work, the brain has to survive being frozen and thawed. And the thing that makes me hesitate to say that cryonics is completely crazy is simply the fact that every paper that's ever been written on the subject of freezing brains or brain tissue or brain cells has essentially always shown that you get almost complete recovery, no matter what the technique was, no matter how poor the technique was. And in fact, even if the technique was applied to quote-unquote dead brain tissue. And so it makes me wonder about how much damage is actually happening in a large brain. Maybe a brain has less damage than some of the organs that people have studied.
Dying is not a sudden process. Various organs of the body die at different rates. The brain dies very quickly. The liver takes longer, the kidneys longer still, and the kidneys are probably still alive about 2 hours after the patient has died. We make use of this when we do our organ transplants. Now, when it comes to thinking about the brain, that is a different matter, because at the moment, we can't transplant a brain even if the brain is still alive, because the nerves of the brain don't grow. How much less, therefore, will we be able to transplant a brain that has been frozen? And this, in my opinion, makes a complete nonsense of the whole concept of cryonics, people being frozen at death. At the moment, I think the whole of the arguments in favor of this must be described as pseudoscience. I know a lot of people are making a lot of money out of persuading people to be frozen at death. And of course, I'm not going to stop people having whatever they want done to their body when they die. But I do think people must realize that there is no way that they are going to be reanimated, not with the current state of knowledge.
Is it possible to imagine ways of repairing cells that we don't have today? And if you could imagine a machine that repaired cells, you might imagine something that looked a lot like a cell, because cells repair cells, and cells are machines. And the question is, could we make machines similar in complexity to a cell? And many people think that we can. So, back to the question of cryonics. Is it something that's crazy? Is it something that cannot work? I can't tell, because I still don't know if future technology will ever be able to reverse present damage.
Dr. Paul Siegel is researching into the possibilities of operating on living people at low temperatures.
Operating on a patient at 37 centigrade with the heart beating, the brain working, the lungs breathing, is kind of like trying to fix a car with the engine running.
The problem is, he's got to stop and start humans as easily as a car. That's what he's attempting to do with this hamster, just as he did with Miles the dog. Paul Siegel thinks it shows that clinical death can be reversible. Having injected the hamster with an anesthetic, they cool it down.
After about a minute, you can just bury him in crushed ice.
This shows the hamster's heartbeat.
He's beating at about 30 beats per minute. Normal heart rate for these animals run over 300. That heartbeat will very soon...
At about 3 Celsius, they stop its heart beating.
He's arrested. Let's cut the respirator. At this point, the animal is in cardiac arrest and therefore can be said to be clinically dead.
The blood's replaced with an alternative liquid to ensure he will revive.
The hamster has now been clinically dead for over 25 minutes.
To revive him, they've got to pop his blood back and warm him up.
I think we got a beat here. That's a good sign. Is this what? Oh, it's almost 30 beats per minute. He's about 28 beats a minute.
Yeah, look at jolt up a bit. Watch his chest.
He's starting to breathe. He's breathing. He's moving. We can pull a respirator too.
He's breathing on his own now. Temperature's rising, and within an hour he looks almost normal.
Ordinarily, a hamster like this would be expected to recover and live long term.
Can this be used as evidence that clinical death is not final? And does it say anything about whether cryonics will work or not?
One of the questions that Dr. Siegel's experiments with the hamster raise is whether the hamster was in fact clinically dead. Well, my belief is that probably it wasn't clinically dead, because there have been some very well documented cases of human beings who've been trapped under the ice in water. And in fact, in that situation, when the body is cooled down, the oxygen demands of the brain become very slight. And even though the heart is not working and the blood is not circulating and the lungs are not filling with air, it's possible that there's enough residual oxygen for the brain to remain very minimally active.
I think that at some point, when we get better with our technology, when possible, cryonic suspensions will start after death, and that's when we can show that this is a reversible technology. However, just because a person is dead by today's standards, it doesn't mean that person is dead by tomorrow's standards.
seems to me that the issue of cryonics raises, as well as scientific questions, moral questions as well. And as with any moral question, those are issues that have to be discussed and decided upon by all of us. And it seems to me that the ethical questions that cryonics raises are of two kinds. The first is whether it's appropriate that money should be put into research and into cryonics itself in order to extend the life, the quantity of life for some individuals, when the quality of life for so many people is very poor. And, for example, there are many people who don't have enough to eat. And the second question is really a wider one, and that concerns whether this is an appropriate thing for us to be striving to do. Medicine has allowed us to live for longer than we used to in the past. And the question is, how far do we want to extend this, and how far will this put the balance of nature out?
After organs are removed from heart-beating cadavers, they only have a certain limited time that they can stay alive before they're transplanted. You can only keep a kidney alive for 3 days, a heart alive for half a day, a liver alive for a day and a half. We would like to break this time barrier by being able to cool organs to very low temperatures. Once the organs are cooled to very low temperatures, you should be able to store them as long as you want.
The problem is, if they're allowed to freeze, they'll die.
We have a technique which we are trying to develop in my laboratory called vitrification. Vitrification would allow the organs to be cooled to very, very low temperatures without freezing.
These two beakers contain different concentrations of antifreeze suitable for living organs. The one on the right is very concentrated. The left one is mainly water. Liquid nitrogen cools the beakers, and at minus 120 degrees Celsius, the left one has completely frozen, whereas the concentrated antifreeze solution has become very gooey. As the temperature drops further, it becomes so thick that it solidifies. It becomes a glass. This is known as the vitrified state. If we try to preserve a kidney in the left beaker, it will freeze, but one placed in antifreeze solution will vitrify. These two kidneys were injected with liquid rubber which set. The kidneys were sliced open to reveal their internal structures.
And as you can see, the vitrified kidney's internal structure is normal, whereas the internal structure on the frozen kidney shows severe damage. In this kidney, massive cracks have developed. Ice formation in the kidney is accompanied by a lot of mechanical stress, which leads to this cracking. So this would obviously be a disastrous situation in a kidney that was to be transplanted. So we do believe that vitrification better preserves the structure of the kidney. Now, where do we go with this technique? This is a human kidney. As you can see, this human kidney dwarfs the rabbit kidneys in size. And the problems of applying this technique of vitrification to an organ this size are significant. We don't know if we'll be able to overcome those problems, but we have hope that we'll be able to overcome those problems and thereby allow more people to receive life-saving transplants in the future and have better lives and longer lives as a result of that.
When organic substances are frozen at liquid nitrogen temperatures, they undergo strange changes. These people were frozen at death. If in future they're revived, will they be the same person? If they don't remember their previous life, will they be someone else? Christopher's not been frozen, but he suffered brain damage and forgotten part of his previous life.
When I first came home, I saw the picture of me in an RAF uniform, and I didn't believe it was me because I cannot remember wearing the RAF uniform. Up until I actually joined the Royal Air Force, it seems to be okay. And then it's a blinking blank.
The difference with Christopher now to what he was is a personality change. It's like having an entirely different boy now to what he was previously.
We had one son for 20 years, and now we've got a different one.
Scientists think that what we learn and therefore memorise is stored in different parts of our brain, but in particular in a small area called the hippocampus. The hippocampus contains brain cells called neurons. Each neuron has a tree-like structure with many branches. Along these branches there are places where one neuron seems to touch another. In fact, there's a very small gap between them. At the gap, electrical signals burst little bubbles filled with chemicals which cross the gap and set up an electrical signal in the other neuron. Dr. John Larson believes that our memories are stored around these gaps. In his experiments, he's taught this rat to remember certain smells.
Lemon versus strawberry.
Strawberry and lemon odours come out of two holes. The rat has learnt that if it sticks its nose into the strawberry hole, it will be rewarded with water. To find out what's going on inside the rat's brain while it's learning, John's recorded its brain waves.
On the oscilloscope here, we can see the brain activity as the animal is actively sniffing an odor. You can see repeated waves of activity at about 5 per second. This is the magic rhythm of the brain that's used to, we think, store memories.
Ideally, he would like to look inside the rat's brain before and after it's learnt the trick. But since that's not possible, he takes slices of brain from an untrained rat and prepares to stimulate them with the magic 5 cycles per second learning rhythm. It's the closest he can get to teaching the brain slices the strawberry trick.
Now, I'm going to activate the cells at 5 hertz. So here it goes. Now, if we compare the response before with the size of the response afterwards, you see that there's been a large increase in the strength of the connection between the two cells.
John thinks that after stimulating the rat slices with the magic learning pattern, the connection between the brain cells is strengthened and memories are stored here. Using an electron microscope to magnify the brain slices 75,000 times, they can see changes in shape around the gap. This is the shape of a section on the receiving end of the gap before stimulation. And this shows the shape of a similar section after stimulation. If John is right, every time you learn something, your brain changes shape. It's as if our memories are held in these chain structures in the brain. But does this mean that if people were brought back from the deep freeze, they would still have their memories?
If the other functions of the brain, its sensory functions, thought processes, were to survive intact, there's no necessary reason to think that memories would be lost.